Welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
I'm great. It's beautiful out, and I love doing this. This is like the best part of my week, and I get a buddy to talk to today. Michael, that we're going to be introduced in a second, is actually a friend and colleague of mine, so I'm excited he's on the show.
Yeah, today we're lucky enough to be welcoming Dr. Michael Lifshitz onto the show. Michael is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at McGill University and the Jewish General Hospital in Montreal. He did his PhD in neuroscience at McGill and then a postdoctoral fellowship in anthropology at Stanford. He's interested in a whole bunch of things, like plasticity of consciousness, and he studies practices that aim to transform our subjective experience, from meditation and hypnosis to placebo, prayer, and psychedelics. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Where are
Um,
you, Mark? Where is it sunny at?
I'm just outside of Toronto, near Hamilton, actually, in a little town called Dundas. It's lovely here. Not where you are. Is it terrible where you are?
Today is a bit of a rainy day,
Yeah, it's
but
been like
it's
that
been
mostly
nice.
this week. Yeah.
yeah, I'm speaking in rainy East London, so you guys actually don't.
Yeah.
I've monopolized the rain, I'm afraid. um, Michael, you're doing some really interesting research on the neuroscience of meditation and on a whole bunch of other stuff, hypnosis, tulpamancy. And I want to start with hypnosis because this is something that isn't particularly well understood, or rather, it's something that I have a preconception about that I'm almost certain doesn't align with the reality. So, to kick off, what is hypnosis in the context of your work?
Um, well, I guess hypnosis, it's a bit controversial. So one of the really cornerstone debates in the hypnosis world is whether hypnosis should be understood as a special state of consciousness
Mm,
or as something maybe more general, like just a way of using the power of suggestion. So basically, suggestion, I mean, again, it's kind of like you can think about it in different ways, but it's basically the idea that there's some kind of communicated concept or idea, and it can be communicated in like specific words or just in cues from your environment, like, uh, I don't know, like even just the suggestion, oh, it's a rainy day, maybe I'm going to feel more sad or
yeah.
something. Even without a kind of thinking it explicitly, I might have that kind of cue. And the idea is that suggestions actually have very powerful effects on our thinking, on our emotions, on our behaviors, on our biology. And a lot of these effects happen below the level of consciousness, or we don't really realize they're happening. So, hypnosis, I mean, hypnosis is like kind of often we think of it as this very specific kind of scenario where you have a hypnotist and you have someone who's being hypnotized, and then the hypnotist kind of goes through this procedure called an induction, which is uh, it can be different things, but it usually involves suggestions to relax or to focus your attention in particular ways. And the idea is that that puts you in a specific kind of receptive mind state or brain state, some people might think. And then that state makes you more suggestible. So now, whatever the hypnotist says or whatever you say to yourself will have an even deeper effect than it would in your normal everyday life. But it's actually quite controversial to what extent you need to be in any kind of special state to have really strong influences from suggestions. And it turns out that like people who are really suggestible, because there's a lot of individual variability in who's responsive,
Yeah.
and it turns out that people who are responsive tend to be responsive whether or not they just got a hypnotic induction. And sometimes you can find like almost the same powerful effects, even just in a normal kind of waking scenario. Um, and so that, I mean, there's all kinds of debate. It's actually like a really rich, deep literature in the scientific world that until recently was like kind of put to the side. But even going back to like Charcot and Freud was interested in hypnosis. It's like really built into the whole like lineage of Western psychiatry and psychology. So there's a lot there, a lot to
Yeah,
say.
yeah, the way you've put that, it doesn't sound like, as I imagined it, a separate state. You're either being hypnotized or not being hypnotized. No, it's more like hypnosis is making use of existing mechanics. And if you say the weather is it's raining outside, you're not hypnotizing me. You're just highlighting the fact that I've already got this mechanic of suggestibility that's subconscious.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about particular kinds of states of mind that might make us more susceptible to suggestions. Like, I think there's reason to think, for instance, different meditative states or psychedelic states, or, just being drowsy or feeling more trust towards the person who's hypnotizing you, all kinds of things that just might make your brain or your mind more malleable, more receptive. But to me, like, just the basic concept that the ideas you have about your experience profoundly impact that experience. That's what, to me, I kind of really caught on and rolled with in terms of hypnosis and where most of my work in that domain has been. So then, like, I started thinking a lot about how meditation is this other kind of practice, which we normally think of as like quite distinct from hypnosis. Or I guess, again, there's like all kinds of different ways of thinking about it. And a lot of people, would ask the question like, is hypnosis um, or is meditation one form of self hypnosis, or like, are they the same thing? Are they different? And I think for me, so then asking that question, and the way I started asking that question was just by calling up meditation researchers and asking them what they thought about hypnosis.
Yeah, right away. I don't like it. I don't. Well,
Yeah,
because I think you'd like to think that, well, at least the meditation that I do, you'd like to think that you're getting to something real. You're not just putting yourself into an altered state, or you're not just giving yourself high suggestibility. But then, even just you bringing that up and me pushing that line, I think would that actually be such a bad thing? Because actually, there's a lot of benefit you could probably have by suggesting the right sorts of things to you in the right sorts of states. But I just be honest, it makes me feel a little bit weebly to think meditation is just sort of a kind of hypnosis.
yeah. So what you just said is like the paradigmatic.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I don't want meditation is about getting at something real,
Yeah.
and hypnosis is a way of kind of tricking yourself, or
Right.
like
Right.
fabricating something that's not real. And
Right.
so, like, a lot of meditators and like meditation researchers and teachers are kind of like, keep your hypnosis away from my
Yeah.
patients. But to me, that's just like, so there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I think for one, I think the concept of like real is really complicated, and I
Yeah.
think the idea that meditation is getting at something real, um, it's complicated for a few reasons. I mean, for one, like, a lot of types of meditation are about fabricating very specific states of mind,
Sure.
um, or using your imagination in specific kinds of ways.
That's right.
Um, but then it's also just, I mean, I think that's a really probably complicated conversation that we could maybe have like a bit down the line or something, but about what it even means to think that you're getting at something real, even if
Yeah.
you're doing something like an insight practice.
Yeah.
What is this real thing that
Yeah.
you're getting at?
Yeah.
Um, but also, even if like your goal is to generate something like insight, or if your goal is to for instance, in like a kind of Mahamudra or Dzogchen context, or something that's a meditation context where basically you're trying to clarify the mind and kind of remove obstacles to perceiving something that supposedly is already always true about your mind, um, or seeing some kind of background condition for the arising of any experience or something like that. Even in those situations, to me, suggestion seems really useful,
Yeah.
because it's not like just because you're suggesting something, it has to be something that's not real, right? Like, you could be suggesting, um, I mean, one thing we know is that suggestions have a lot of impact on your attention. So you can suggest changes in attention, and that'll have a very strong effect. So, for instance, you could say, um, for the next 10 minutes, I want to be very clear minded. And that's a suggestion. And so, actually, what becomes interesting is then you start to realize that a lot of meditation instructions and a lot of actually like the practices, even when it's like a practice that's very kind of coming to a very bare awareness of experience or coming into your body or kind of a simple concentration state or something like recognizing the nature of awareness, those kinds of practices often have a lot of suggestion built into them. And even then you get things like, like entering a jhana, you set an intention to enter the jhana in a certain kind of way, and then, or maybe for a certain amount of time. And it's that intention, that kind of like verbal or symbolic concept that like somehow resonates through your cognitive system and then allows that specific mind state to come to exist in that way. Or I think you see the same thing in like Dzogchen practice. I mean, it's really not my expertise, but from what I understand, there's this idea of like pointing out instructions,
Exactly.
different ways that meditation teachers will kind of disrupt the usual patterning of someone's thinking and like drop the right kind of thought or the right kind of attentional shift at the right moment, which allows someone to shift into a new state. So I think, to me, all of that, it's like, that's all kind of hypnosis to me.
And what then do you see the potential benefits to be of in these various states, hypnosis, especially relating to what I've read as cognitive and emotional flexibility?
I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm really interested in too, and kind of why I went more in like an anthropological and social science direction, is because I think the idea of benefit is complicated. Like it just really depends what you're after. And I think, we have a lot of ideas about, yeah, obviously, like the research world has tended to focus on like mental health in a particular kind of way, which is embedded in like this kind of DSM, like psychiatry, and all these ideas about what it means to be well and what it means to like function well and feel good. And to me, it's kind of like as I engage more with like other kinds of literatures, like I don't know, even just reading like kind of like more queer literature or like kind of more like things that kind of call into question certain ideas about what the good life is in the first place and like what it means to be well, or whether wellness is even something that, or kind of like the social construction of the concept of wellness. And again, like I'm not at all an expert in those things yet, or I hope to learn more as I go. But I think, so I guess like it's just like an ongoing journey for me where I'm kind of constantly coming up against ways in which I assume that certain kinds of things are good. And then I realize that actually maybe not. Like a really simple example is like anger, or states like fear or anger,
Yeah.
where I think a lot of the times you see in like discourse around mindfulness or around kind of contemplative practice, not to reduce or say that this is like that all the literature is just making this kind of simplification, but I think it is a tendency to say things like, you know, well, basically that that you're trying to kind of overcome fear, overcome negative emotions, overcome things like your ego, uh, anger, and then I just think then you come up into situations where you realize that those kinds of responses actually have a lot of adaptive benefit.
Yeah, they're 2 billion-year-old systems, that have been growing in for a really long time. So of course they have some adaptive function. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wonder. I wonder just there about like the overcoming. You're right. I think that's I can you can definitely see that. I think in the community and in the literature, you can sort of, yeah. I mean, I can understand why somebody might take the overcoming mean to like kind of squash. But probably overcoming could also mean something like coming to recognize and understand and correctly contextualize, so that you're afraid when it's pertinent to be afraid, but you're not afraid as a default mode, or something. And does that have something to do, because I know some of your work has been on this idea of cognitive and emotional flexibility. And like if we take off the shelf sort of wholesale well-being, it does seem to me like to a certain degree having flexibility of mind and having the flexibility to adjust our emotional sets appropriately to the situation does seem like something we would want as a cognitive emotional organism. You know, you don't want to get stuck in any one set past its goodness. That seems like if there's one thing I could say about well-being, I think it would be that. Like, I don't know much about well-being, but I know getting stuck in one set past its goodness is probably a problem regardless of your standard of well-being. And that's something you've been interested in your research, right?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I think the idea of flexibility intuitively makes sense to me. Like, you know, for instance, I often get kind of queasy or like allergic or something lights up in me when I hear anything about like ego being bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, like
Yeah.
ego is complicated and ego can be like,
Yeah.
or the sense of self or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Narratives, like I find often there's this talk of kind of like, you are not your stories, or like there's this kind of sense that it would be better to live in a kind of grounded in your body in a way where you're not kind of extending a story about yourself into the future, into the past. And I think like, I don't know if anyone actually really believes that, because it just seems so implausible to me that like what, why, why would you not want to have a story about, like, how could anything meaningful?
Yeah.
Meaning just doesn't make sense. Like meaning only is a story, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, to me then anything like about anything like that doesn't really make sense. But then it becomes really clear to in my own experience, like it's really nice sometimes to be able to just drop all the stories for a second.
Yeah. Yeah. So targeted use of that wisdom where now you're carrying around a trauma long past the point where it seems applicable anymore. Like let's say in a different context when you were much younger, you had an issue and now you're still acting that out with your current partner, even though that was a 5-year-old thing and now you're 30 years old and you have all these new skills and abilities. That seems like the right kind of place where you might want to target that wisdom and say, well, look, you need to flexibly update the way that you're seeing the world because you're not 5 years old and you have all these new skills and abilities. So maybe it's time to drop that narrative. So I hear you with that targeted approach, but you're right. I mean, it's very weird to think, what do you want to live with no history where you don't know who you are or none of that matters? Of course that matters to us.
Right. So I think to me the idea of like some kind of flexible, like holding things lightly, except I guess in moments you might want to hold things tightly, actually, like if
Right.
they're slipping out of your grasp and they're really important to you.
Right.
um,
So like right grip, the ability to
yeah,
right grip your life so you can let go, but you can also hold when
yeah.
you choose for more controllability in a way.
I just find, and I don't know, like I need to kind of do a deeper, I don't have like a really fine grained analysis of this, but it's an instinct that I have that there seems to be a kind of prioritizing, or, you know, like the pendulum has shifted towards um, thinking that letting go is better than holding on. And to me, like holding on is just as important as letting go.
We just had Adam Safron on, and he was talking about entropy in the brain. You know, you've got this big, you know, it's a pretty hot topic right now that you have all these stuck beliefs, and they're a bit nasty and a bit cruddy and a bit outdated. And then what you want to do with psychedelics or with meditation or with prayer or with anything else that does this, you can create more entropy in the brain. Now things get looser and hotter and wider, and then it cools. But it was cool talking to Adam because he was like, yeah, but like, let's make sure we're clear. You don't want to just heat the brain up. You don't only just let go of your old stuff.
Yeah.
Because also, you know, some things like schizophrenia might be typified by too much entropy. Now you don't know where to be or where the valleys of importance are. And that's got to be just as important as getting rid of the bad stuff, as you've got to install good stuff. And that's got to be properly gripped hard where things that matter to you matter, like really matter.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I guess to me then too, kind of pushing towards the edges of my thinking, I feel like then there's also this, I'm really interested in the question of agency and like particularly experiences where you feel that there's some kind of agency that exceeds you that you're kind of following or like surrendering to. So obviously like in hypnosis, that's a good kind of example where you have a hypnotist and then what allows you, I think, to respond deeply to the suggestion is to really trust and surrender to it's basically like you're kind of like installing the control of the, or like the will of the hypnotist in place of your own in a kind of like strategic way that I don't think like there's a a myth that like a hypnotist could just like make you do something you really wouldn't want to do, and I don't think that's quite true. It seems from the literature, it seems like at some point you can kind of like kick in and decide I don't want to do this anymore. But then there's other situations like I mean, prayer or psychedelics are really interesting because often what happens is that people feel like they're in touch with some kind of intelligence or trajectory of being, or like whether it's like God or some kind of spirit, or you know um, or it can be like being in a forest and feeling like there's some kind of thing happening there that's larger than you that actually has a kind of logic to it.
Have you done any research here, Michael? Like, do you have any interesting findings from this sort of field, even if they're sort of preliminary findings? I'd love to hear.
Um, I mean, yeah, uh, we're definitely doing a lot of research on like trying to understand how people cultivate experiences where they feel that there's an agency that like whether it's the will of God when they're speaking in tongues that kind of comes into their body, and then that has particular effects in the brain that we're interested in. um, so I can go into that, but maybe just like the general thing that I think is kind of interesting about it is that then it also complicates this idea that like when you say like flexibly updating or like almost like choosing when to grip and when to let go or something.
Yeah.
But I feel like all of that, and here I'm really kind of just like
Yeah, come on, bring it.
going into like a philosophical stone philosopher mode. But like I think that still has this implication that there's like a central subject who can make a decision, who can know what's right for themselves, right? And I feel like what's interesting is to think like I think I'm really interested in in learning to listen beyond ourselves. And I don't know, like I think that can come in many different ways. That can mean like listening to other people's experiences who are maybe different, who can show you that what you think is the right thing for like the right way to modulate your attention is maybe actually a very narrow way of you know or like that just that there's something you're not seeing about yourself or about the world. And then I think also learning to listen to like non-human forces, like I and again it's really like not something I understand yet, but I know there's a lot of interesting work in anthropology and obviously just like in outside of academia, thinking about how being surrounded by like a forest or different kinds of living beings who are not human, that there's actually like some really meaningful information about life. I mean, like most basically, right? Like it's just like we're in an ecosystem, we're killing ourselves as a species. Like there's something about realizing that the kind of like types of optimization that we think are good might be a very kind of um, yeah,
Suboptimal way of organizing.
I, yeah, and then and they also there's also all kinds of like cultural and historical trajectories that make us think that a certain kind of thing is optimal.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess I'm just interested in my own life too, in kind of this balance between kind of self-regulation and then sometimes just like not like sometimes something draws me and it actually feels really unhealthy, you know? And it's like, you know, so there's this kind of rational, like calm, balanced mind that would be like, oh, I shouldn't do that thing. That's kind of like throwing me off kilter, or that's like an unknown, that's risky, that feels like, I don't know, even like hedonistic or like giving into some kind of instinct in me that seems dangerous. But I think often, you know, like I'm not saying we should all just do reckless, crazy things, but there's just something like sometimes you don't know what where things are pulling you, and there's something interesting about kind of like letting yourself be led by forces that you yourself don't understand.
Especially when, as you've described, both in terms of the meditation literature, but also then just in terms of in the macro, like we're killing ourselves as a species, our understanding of good and our current sort of radar of what benefit is not necessarily anything to shout about. We're quite good at telling stories, quite aggressive, dramatic stories, and making a whole song and dance that this is the dream and this is the utopia. On the one hand, like, I don't want to be a self or have a narrative, and somehow I've calculated that meaning is going to be preserved, and also like, oh well, this is sensible and rational, and therefore must be pursued. But as you say, like, I think anyone who asks themselves like, when have I made a decision that did seem risky and off kilter or even verging on hedonistic, when was that for the best? Because the truth is, I don't think we're pulled to things for no reason, right? Our intuition is not this total slave to rationality, and that's the thing that leads the way. And I wonder, when you talk about agency there, is that the kind of thing you're getting at in part?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like my kind of overarching research question, which is kind of hard to like quite grasp, is like, how do you find guidance? Like, like I'm kind of interested in my own life. There's this kind of like mysterious, mystical guidance thing that, and I don't know what it is, and I'm not like I feel like I'm a mystic in the sense that I really just think things are very mysterious. Like, and I don't like I'm very kind of agnostic, but I'm struck like even just like having a dream that feels so significant, or like even when I decided to do my postdoc, um, like I was thinking, where should I do my postdoc, and then I read about Tanya Lerman's work, who I ended up working with, and my friend was like, you should look into her work, and then I did, and as soon as I looked at it, I was reading it, and I remember, and sometimes I have these experiences like on the computer, like I'll be looking at a website and my whole body kind of starts tingling. Like I just have this feeling like this.
There it is. That's the thing right there. And that's going to happen. It's going to work. This is now
Yeah,
going to work.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And even though, like, you know, then I emailed her and she was like, I don't have any money for you, sorry, like whatever. You know, like there were things that had to happen, but it was just some. I'm just really interested in like creating a space in my own life. And I think this is part of what spiritual practice often is like learning to listen for some kind of mysterious guidance. And I think it's like really hard to kind of scientifically articulate what that might be. But so that's why like I've been interested in particular practices that I think start to get us somewhat in that direction.
It sounds very much like Taoism, you know, and I mean it permeates, I think, the other major cultures. I mean, of course, Christianity and I think Buddhism as well, but like in Taoism, it comes forward in a strong way, you know, where the sage is one who has, by relinquishing too much preference over the individual local stuff, has started to grok the way, the great way, you know, the big long ranging dynamic turnings of seasons. And so the sage seems as though they're psychic. I think I've read that somewhere. They seem like they're psychic, but they're not psychic. It's just that they're now in touch with how the way moves. So they move with the way. Yeah, and then you're right. And then all the practices are about freeing you up from being, addicted or overly attached to any of the little micro stuff that prevents you from seeing some of the macro stuff.
Right. But so then is the way in that kind of perspective, because I guess what's interesting about like what I'm talking about is it feels very personal.
Yeah,
Like it's a lot of, and maybe that's also like a reflection of the culture I live in, that we all grew up in, and so on. But like it feels like it's this kind of personal journey, obviously like connected into larger forces, and other kind of collective journeys and stuff. But I think there's something like a personal mythology or something that like starts to unfold, and I don't know. Like I can't tell too if this is just like some kind of like almost like childish, like fantastical, like privileged kind of um, desire or
it's
way of like moving through the
it
world.
sounds to me just like meaning making.
Right.
Like we have to find some meaning in our life. I completely resonate with this. I actually feel very, very sad. I think lots of people feel like this. It might be just part of what it is to be us. Is there any way that you're bringing this? Because I love to, I love this discussion we're having. Is there any way that you like? Are you able to take these like life aims and put them in the lab? Do you get to cross pollinate these sort of personal trajectory with your research? Because I'd love to hear some of the research here too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I became really interested in um, like personified experiences of encountering personified presences. So basically, like an example would be like meeting a spirit.
Oh, we got to get into this. Keep coming because I want to come back around to this. Keep going.
Okay, I mean, this is basically what I'm really interested in.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I've had experiences, like maybe most notably, like smoking DMT, where it feels, and it's very common, it feels like there's a higher intelligence of some sort, really like pretty clearly just berating you with lessons, like like you've got it wrong, like here's what, or just like holding you in some kind of like loving presence. But basically there's really this strong feeling that there's someone else or something beyond you that's present in your mind or in your kind of field of experience that is actually revealing something to you that you yourself didn't already
Yeah. Wow.
kind of have access
Yeah.
People
Spooky.
people speak about this with such certainty and such consistency. Like you hear the same. I've never smoked DMT, but when you speak to people who do cross culturally, they all say with real certainty, experiential, subjective certainty. Yeah, look, there is this. People talk about higher intelligence, or they talk about the connectivity of beings. What's it like the actual experience of, like phenomenologically? How do you meet that?
to. I mean, I think it's probably different from everyone. For me, it's like this. I haven't smoked DMT that many times, but when I do, it's this kind of like very quick, imagistic experience, and a lot of kind of almost like dreamlike images, but pretty vivid and weird, get shown to me very rapidly and with like a lot of emotional impact and a lot of kind of moral and ethical impact. And there's always this sense that there's like some kind of presence that's kind of like orchestrating it, or there's like some, it's not just like a random sequence of images, there's some kind of teleology to it, or there's a moral that's my experience, and who knows like how much that's shaped by things I've read, and but I think that kind of general trajectory is pretty common
How
for
do
people.
we do research on that? I mean, is there any way that we can sort of bring that into the lab or bring that into
Well,
the?
yeah, I mean, so my approach
Yeah. Yeah.
was, I like, so those experiences really moved me, and then I also became really interested in things like active imagination, like the Jungian practice, where you kind of, I mean, in a way, it's like bringing the dream. Because in dreams, right, like we all have these experiences all the time where we encounter a world with agencies and presences and people or beings who aren't kind of materially present, but they feel real and might teach us things.
And they're surprising. We don't know what they're going to do necessarily. They do surprising things.
Yeah. And then, so active imagination is this idea that you can kind of communicate with the dream world, or like that kind of unconscious reservoir of stuff in your waking life, and then you kind of imagine scenarios and you can go quite deep with it. And so I just was really interested in all of that because to me it felt like in my own spiritual practice, like those kinds of encounter moments just really moved me and kind of like shifted the way I think about the world in profound ways. And honestly, I just think it's like there's something aesthetically appealing about it. Like it's just beautiful to me. I think I just like the feeling of the imagination too, or like of it kind of feels like magic. And I think I always liked fantasy and stuff like, like it's, I like the idea of kind of enchanting the world with things that actually feel magical. And so then I turned to Tanya's work because she's been studying for many years and decades people who cultivate relationships with invisible or immaterial presences,
Yeah, this
whether
is what I'd
through
like to
like
talk about.
witchcraft or
Mm.
through prayer, and basically studying like techniques or technologies where you actually like deliberately learn to use your mind in a way that makes your imagination more available to these kinds of experiences.
Yeah.
And then I thought I was particularly interested in this practice called tulpamancy
Yeah.
because, well,
Can you tell us what it is first? What just
yeah.
tulpamancy is?
So tulpamancy is well, it was originally a Tibetan Buddhist practice,
That's right.
but it's kind of mostly forgotten, like to the point where most Tibetan Buddhist scholars I've asked about it were like, that doesn't exist. Um, but I've recently been digging into it more with Michael Sheehy, who's a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and we've kind of he found some texts that specifically refer to it, and it comes from like the dream yoga tradition. And basically, in the dream yoga tradition, the idea is that in the dream world, you learn to manipulate dreamscapes or the happenings of a dream, um, in order to kind of understand that perception is actually more malleable than you realize, and basically to start to understand the processes by which your mind constructs reality. And then there's the flip side of it is there's daytime practices where when you're awake, you kind of conjure forms in your mind. So you basically create illusions deliberately as a way, again, of starting to understand that actually all of your perceptual experiences are in some sense like fabricated illusions. And one of those things, so that's what like a tulpa is kind of a fabricated illusion or a conjured form. And so that's kind of the old idea.
But it's not just any form, right? It's not like a chair. It's a being, right, that has its own sort of intelligence that you can speak to. Is that right?
Yeah, I think in like in the Tibetan practices, I'm not actually sure what the scope of it is, like what exactly counts as a tulpa. But then it comes down to us through, I mean, it became really popular on 4chan and on Reddit. Um,
In our modern times, you
in our
mean?
modern times. So like
What a
around,
funny, what a funny place for an
yeah,
ancient Tibetan imagination practice to like show up on 4chan and Reddit with people just like banging around these practices to see what happens.
yeah. So around like 2011, people became really interested in it, particularly people who called bronies, who are like who love My Little Pony, this TV show, and they really wanted to. They thought it was really cool that they could actually create a kind of imagined version of their pony that like of a character that they loved. And basically, then what they began to do is they created all these guide manuals, and there's this whole community that formed around this idea that you can train your mind to create an entity or a being who is like a person who lives in your mind. And over time, like the more that you interact with this imagined person, kind of like an imaginary friend at first, but then the more that you interact with them, after a while, they actually gain autonomy, they gain free will. And I'd say most tulpamancers actually believe that the tulpa becomes sentient.
So this is really interesting. I don't know much about it, but I sort of have a sense that whoever originally invented this technology in ancient Tibet in order to cut through illusion is rolling around in their grave somewhere thinking the skills and techniques are now being used to create illusion rather than break through illusion. It doesn't sound like this is being used to, understand that reality is malleable and so be free of pain. Sort of sounds like, you're a bit lonely. So you use your imagination in this powerful way to create illusion rather than to divest yourself of illusion.
Yeah. Um, so I think it brings up a lot of kind of complicated questions about, again, like what exactly does it mean that like the self is an illusion? So like for instance, like if the tulpa actually becomes sentient, um, then like is that an illusion, or is there just really a new sentience?
Wow.
Um,
Wow. And have you gotten a chance to do some research on this, like to see, what does that actually look like in a bio basis? And can we get any markers for what's going on under the hood for this kind of process?
yeah, so we collected like fMRI data
Wow.
from 22 expert tulpamancers,
Wow.
and basically we have, so these are people who have like been doing it for a long time. They have very active and kind of robust and willing tulpas. And so then we brought them in. Asked we asked them to basically speak in their minds in different conditions. So we would either ask the they call it the host, like the person who created the original self who created the tulpa. We'd
Yep.
ask the host to speak in their mind, or then we would ask the tulpa to speak in their mind voice, or we had a kind of a simulation control condition where we had the host imagine a friend or like their mom or someone else who isn't a tulpa. So it's like recruiting a lot of the same hypothetical mechanisms like social cognition, imagining a person, hearing a voice, all these things.
Yeah. Language centers.
Yeah, but then crucially, there's not this feeling that there's actually someone else present who really
Yeah.
has.
Some autonomous other.
Yeah. So we basically did that in a couple different ways. And then we also did so tulpamancers can do something called possession, where the tulpa takes over their body or controls certain aspects of their body. So for those who could do that, we also had conditions where people would write things down, or their tulpa would possess their hand and write it down, and so on. And so I wish I could tell you what we found, um, but actually Jonas, who we both know well, is analyzing the fMRI data right now, and I think by the end of this week we might know what we found.
Wow.
Um,
I have
is
hypotheses.
is there consistency amongst people's experiences? So you said like some tulpas can do certain things and others can't. That's an interesting thing because it implies this isn't just sort of. It implies the tool itself is universalized or something we all have access to. Because why else would there be consistency in people's abilities, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, what's interesting about tulpamancy is that there are like very clear guides, like there are techniques that you can follow, and the basic concept is that anyone who like in somewhat of a disciplined, rigorous way follows the techniques should be able to create a tulpa. Um, I think some people struggle more than others. For sure, there's like natural proclivities, but so yeah, I mean, basically, the concept is anyone can do it, but then people choose to focus on different aspects of it. So some people decide I don't really care about possession, like my tulpa's happy just being inside the mind space, and they don't really need access to my body to feel good. Other people, and some people focus on really training the ability to have like full-fledged hallucinations where like their tulpa actually looks like a visual object, like opaque in their visual field, or they hear it like as if it's really an auditory stimulus hitting their ears. But most tulpamancers are kind of like that just takes so much work, and it doesn't really matter because like what matters is I feel like my tulpa is really there with me and we can communicate anyway. Like I don't really care if her voice is like crystal clear. Um,
But the interesting thing is that you mentioned, like, there's an ontology, right? There's a belief system around the tulpas being independent of you.
yeah.
Is that something that there's a wider philosophy around? Because it seems
Um,
like a funky belief in, independently to hold.
yeah. So I think this is also part of what I find really fascinating about the whole practice and community is that, first of all, most tulpamancers are not particularly spiritual or like metaphysical about it. Um,
More like a practical skill. They just want to create this thing, and so they do it.
yeah, but they do come often, and it's not like a homogenous thing where everyone has the same beliefs, um, but they do often come to the conclusion that the tulpa seems to be conscious. But a lot of them are like kind of skeptical at first, like they're curious, but they think it sounds a bit like far fetched, and then they try it for a while, and I mean almost everyone like they kind of struggle with really believing whether the tulpa is real, and I think real is just this. It kind of always brings you back to this question of like, what does it mean for me to be real in the first place,
Yeah.
or what is it? What does it mean for a self to be real?
Yeah.
So then, I think the general sense I get from the tulpamancers I've spoken to is that most of them think something like, in whatever sense, like I'm real, the tulpa is just as real. So, like basically, there's a stream of consciousness, there's a body, there's a brain, and somehow, in some magical way that I personally think we still don't really understand, uh, there's this stream of knowing and of kind of awareness that emerges from that or exists alongside it. And then basically the tulpamancers are saying, well, it seems like bodies and brains can actually host more than one of those. And
Yeah, that your idea that you're one unified thing might be a little bit, and we know that now, right? That you're not really as unified as you think you are. Actually, we're probably more like a permaculture of cognitive processes that loosely cohere. So I
yeah,
don't think it's at all weird to think you could partition already fragmented parts off, draw a wall around them, let them run sort
yeah.
of semi autonomously. Wow.
I think what makes it kind of like more uh, like what takes it one step further is the idea that you might actually be able to be running parallel streams of like actual consciousness.
Yeah, we see that a little bit sometimes in split brain research. They think maybe you're having multiple things happen, although
Yeah.
one is sort of the primary driving the body. I know earlier in our conversation today, you a little bit shied away from the idea of well being or like what's beneficial or non beneficial. But I can't help but think, these practices done, there must be a way that you do them where it can be a bit tenuous or a bit sticky or a bit dangerous because they sound a little bit like you might be engendering forms of pathology as well. So, like split personality syndrome is a really challenging and really scary experience, I think. And I don't know, I mean, maybe you're not the person to ask about this, but is there a relationship between some of these pathological territories and these sorts of practices? Or maybe it's not as easy just to draw that line.
No, yeah. I mean, it's a complicated question.
Right.
So, I mean, one thing, most of the people we've spoken to find it extremely therapeutic.
Right.
So, a lot
Okay.
of people, um, a lot of people are kind of lonely who come to the practice. Definitely not all of them. Some people are just curious or have other reasons. But a lot of them are kind of a little bit socially isolated. Uh, they suffer from like depression, anxiety, all these kinds of things, which most of us suffer from. Um, and then they almost always say that their tulpa has made them so much happier and healthier
Wow.
that like having a friend who they can rely on, who understands them so deeply, who's kind of always there and so loving, um, has been an incredible source of support. And like often also makes people more social ultimately too, because a lot of them will like suffer from certain kinds of social anxiety, and then by having someone who they feel so comfortable with, it actually helps them. It motivates them more to get out into the world and like interact with people and kind
Wow.
of get their life on track. So I think it's like, and so I should say, like, I've experimented or dabbled a little bit in it myself, and from doing that, I can start to understand like why it's, or like at least partly why it's so therapeutic. Like there's I just think there's something really powerful about feeling seen. And like in moments where I'm feeling anxious, sometimes I kind of draw on my tulpa, and there's just, I mean, I don't, I guess it's different for everyone, but for me, I find like often if I'm going through something difficult, just having someone to talk it through with, having the feeling that someone else is there with me sharing the experience, or kind of like holding my experience in their presence, is really soothing. And I find that I can get a feeling like that even from my kind of proto tulpa.
Wow.
So
I've been running the experiment in some micro way as we've been talking, and I can immediately get it.
yeah,
Like totally, right? And I think that's it's probably this not a dissimilar mechanic in some ways to having someone who isn't a tulpa having another person. Like as you say, the mechanic of feeling seen, the mechanic of feeling like the experience is shared, the feeling and the usefulness of the dialogue.
yeah.
Um,
Actually, I was kind of like kicking myself because, or I think what would be a really nice experiment to do would be something like a tulpa hand holding pain experiment. Like, there's these experiments showing that like if someone you love is holding your hand,
Oh, it's great.
you're
It's great. Now, can you do that with a tulpa holding your hand? Is a really
yeah,
cool
because I would
experiment.
imagine, like, I think that's basically the mechanism of therapy. I mean, it's it's not just that, but I think there's something really fundamental about that kind of just feeling held. And but then I should say, on the other hand, like, so most people we speak to are like, not, they don't have dissociative identity or multiple personality disorder. They don't have psychosis. But and it doesn't seem like, unless you already have maybe some kind of vulnerability, I don't think that tulpamancy often goes that way. I think
Right.
there's obviously you see things sometimes, like with any practice, or there's always certain risks, but what you also see sometimes is people who are starting to struggle with psychosis like symptoms, or kind of having, like, they start to hear certain voices, or they start to feel like their cognition is getting disorganized and there's other presences that are interfering with their lives, and then they stumble upon tulpamancy, and then by kind of having this frame that's more, where they can kind of almost like channel those, uh, the way that their mind is starting to slip out of their reach, and having certain kinds of frames around it, it actually helps them contain those experiences and make them much more healthy and kind of beneficial.
Wow.
So I think it's complicated, but in my experience, it's usually therapeutic.
Do you have any insight on how the ancient Tibetans, just because you've sort of like bumped into a couple of the old suttas or texts with this in it, how did they end up using? Did they use the tulpas at all in any of these ways? Do you know? Like, is there anything about like making another presence and then having it do anything or be in any way? I wonder.
Not not with like tulpas that I'm aware of. I mean, I think the related thing is like yidam practices, or like deity yoga practices, where, and I still don't really understand. I've never practiced those practices, but it seems like you're kind of visualizing a bodhisattva, or maybe a guru, or some kind of like deity who has certain characteristics or qualities that you actually want to learn from them or kind of merge with. And so, you'll have practices where you're kind of visualizing this being, and then I still can't really get a clear. I've asked a few different people about whether you ever speak to the deity, and it seems like a bit kind of informal, maybe sometimes, other times no. But
So,
but certainly there's qualities of their mind that you then are trying to imbue into yourself. So then you kind of merge them into you, which to me seems in a lot of ways similar to what people are doing with like praying to God or having a
Yeah.
tulpa.
Yeah. I heard a story one time about a tulpa in Tibetan Buddhism. And I can't remember the monk or nun who this story relates to. But the story was that they had created a tulpa over time. And the reason they did it was because they were on long retreat and somebody had to go get the groceries. And so they produced a split in their experience so that the primary consciousness could continue to sit in the meditation box in the cave. And the tulpa driving the body outside of that experience could go and get the food from the local village and bring it back. But the experience for the monk or nun was one of opening their eyes after meditation and their groceries had been delivered by their tulpa, so that they could keep practicing in a consistent, persistent,
Right.
in the way that they had dedicated themselves to practicing.
That's
What
cool. I've never heard that story.
what do you think, if there's a takeaway lesson, a takeaway principle here from the tulpas and the experience people have had with them, what would that lesson be?
Well, I guess my mind goes two places. One is like, so I mean, basically, you can think about, like, if you kind of zoom out, in a way, then a tulpa becomes like a way of accessing. I mean, self is a complicated word, as we're kind of seeing over and over again, but like accessing something in your kind of body mind that exceeds your normal self, like your ego self boundaries, or at least your kind of conscious, willful capacities, and that can give you all kinds of insights and reflections and guidance and support that you wouldn't be able to access if you were not trying to kind of create this reflection mechanism somehow. So to me, it's just kind of like a really clear illustration, or like maybe a kind of intensified or extrapolated illustration of the power of seeking guidance from your unconscious.
Yeah.
And it just seems like one really potent technology that people have developed to do that in a way that really supports them and like that they get a lot out of, and that maybe has these other, that maybe actually creates another being, and kind of fundamentally restructures like the whole body mind system. And then the other side of it, which I guess is related, is kind of like, and comes back to the idea of flexibility, is just that rather than thinking about like contemplative practices or spiritual practices as somehow like an attempt to like transcend the self, to realize that like the self is like basically like a kind of creativity of the self, like that you can fashion yourself in all of these ways that like we don't even realize are possible, and that the self is this kind of constructed thing. And so I think tulpamancy is really interesting because you actually see a self get constructed from the ground up. And I think there's something there about just like the possibilities of constructing our own selves in creative new ways, and kind of the power of the imagination as a site for self-fashioning.
Wonderful.
Michael, where can everybody find you?
Find me?
If any listeners want to find you online, where should they go?
Google Scholar? I don't know. I don't really do social media too much.
Or at your office at
Or
McGill.
at my office at McGill.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but by
Montreal.
email, I guess. I think like my email should be pretty easy to find. Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on. That's an episode we haven't had before, and I'm massively grateful that we did have it. So thanks so much for coming on. This has been the Contemplative Science Podcast. And as always, we will see you next week.